Hello, and welcome to the Davis Parent University Lecture Series, now incredibly in its 14th year of bringing you nationally renowned authors and speakers who present tips and tools for raising engaged, empathetic, ethical young people. We are coming to you via video today because our organizers wanted to ensure that this presentation on transgender children is as conducive to learning and as widely available and accessible as possible. Special thanks to Davis Media Access and the Davis Joint Unified School District Leadership Team, whose support enabled the quick transition from being an in-person event to being here on video for you today. We also would like to thank DPU's business and community partners. A special thank you to Davis Parent University's longtime Dean's List sponsor, Lori Prismich of Remax Gold, and to DPU's other generous sponsors and community partners, including Davis Schools Foundation, DJ USD PTAs and PTOs, Davis Phoenix Coalition, Dr. Matthew Molitor Orthodontics, Chris Lawson, Aperture Alley Photography, Hyatt Place UC Davis, and Avid Reader Bookstore of Davis, which currently has copies of our speaker's book available. We're going to begin with a 45-minute talk by our keynote speaker, Rachel Pepper, followed by a 30-minute Q&A session with questions that were submitted ahead of time by audience members. If you think of a question for our speaker during her presentation, please feel free to email it to DPU at davisparented@gmail.com. After the event, Rachel will answer a selection of these questions, and her answers will be shared through an online platform called Padlet. It's like an online notice board. It's also going to include additional resources and will be available on DPU's homepage. That's davisparentuniversity.com. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Rachel Pepper. She is a nationally recognized expert on gender identity development in children and teens, a licensed marriage and family therapist, and a much sought-after public speaker and educator. Rachel is the author of 4 books, including Transitions of the Heart, an award-winning collection of essays by mothers of transgender children, and the best-selling The Transgender Child, this book right here, a handbook for parents and professionals supporting transgender and non-binary children. This is now in its 2nd revised edition. Rachel's books have been translated into German, Icelandic, and soon into Spanish. She graduated from the University of Toronto with a BA in political science and English. She also has a master's in journalism from Chicago's Columbia College with a specialty in public affairs reporting. She also received an MA in counseling psychology from the California Institute of Integral Studies with an emphasis in community mental health. And 10 years ago, she became licensed as a therapist, and her clinical specialty is working with the LGBT community. Rachel lives with her family and a flock of chickens on an urban farm in the Sacramento region. Without further ado, please welcome to the podium our keynote speaker, Rachel Pepper.
My talk today is really a talk about love. I say it's about love because my talk is about how we care as parents and a community for our children. Accepting and honoring who a child is and believing them when they tell you themselves who they are is an act of love. And thus, even me being invited to speak here today and the act of my doing so are done from love. We are here today together because of love. My book, The Transgender Child, a handbook for parents and professionals, co-written with Gender Spectrum founder Stephanie Brill, is now in its 2nd edition. It has sold tens of thousands of copies and been translated into multiple languages. Writing that book back in 2007, and then revising it again last year for its 2nd edition, reminded me of how far we have come since then, and also of how much really hasn't changed at all. The concerns a parent may have, the discrimination families may face, these things haven't changed much in most of the country. But what also hasn't changed is the determination of parents to do the right thing for their child, no matter how hard this may be, and to do it with love. So rather than being a book focused on danger and fear, we wrote a book about love, designed to bring hope to families and provide a lifeboat for parents struggling to understand their child's, and therefore their own, gender journey. A lesser-known book I wrote, but a personal favorite of mine, Transitions of the Heart, Stories of Love, Struggle, and Acceptance, published back in 2012, is also definitely about love. It's a collection of essays by mothers of transgender children, teens, and adults who have learned to walk through the path of shock, confusion, and grief, through to acceptance, understanding, and advocacy. Both books are about the hope that comes when we change our minds, learn a new way of thinking, and believe that difference is just another way of being. Love brings us here today, as does compassion, nurturance, humility, advocacy, understanding, and acceptance. These factors are all present with us today, and with you for whenever you watch this. And likely, these same factors are also the basis for the invitation from the Davis Parent University for me to give this talk, and I'd like to thank them for the invitation and their support of this topic and my work. So who am I, and why was I invited here today? As you know, my name is Rachel Pepper, and I believe I have been invited to speak with you all today because of a growing interest in understanding the unique needs of transgender children and their families. I'm a licensed therapist in the state of California and have worked for many agencies and healthcare organizations, including Kaiser Permanente. My career as a therapist has developed in part due to a personal and professional calling to care for the LGBT community, including to provide gender-affirming care for trans children, teens, and their families. As well as practicing clinically, I have written or co-written 4 books, hundreds of articles, spoken at many conferences, and given workshops across the US and Canada. I'm also a parent, a spouse, an avid reader, and yes, an heirloom tomato farmer. Some questions I imagine you may have today include, but are not limited to, who are these transgender children and teens? Why do there suddenly seem to be so many of them? How do we support them in their journey towards self-actualization? How do we examine our own misperceptions about these young people and about trans and non-binary people in general? If I'm a teacher or a coach, or work at a school, or with young people in the community, what are some best practices? If I am training to be a physician or a mental health specialist, what do I need to know? If I'm a parent, how do I protect my child against hurtful prejudice? How do I, as a neighbor, uncle, or grandparent, speak up for a young person in my family or community? Indeed, how do I become an ally for children and teens at a contradictory time when trans visibility and social acceptance is at an all-time high, but also at the same cultural and political moment where trans children and their families are being used as political pawns, and a growing backlash to affirmative care is being enacted in the media and in legislation across our country? Those are a lot of questions, and we cannot possibly fully answer all of them today. But we will get to discussions on gender identity development, aspects of social and medical transition, and some considerations about the rights of transgender children in school. I hope if you come away with any message from me today, it will be to remember how you can make a difference in the life of a child or teen if they tell you that they are transgender, gender non-binary, or gender diverse in some other way. I hope you will remember that having just one supportive adult in a transgender teen's life cuts their risk of suicide by 40%. That using the correct name or pronoun is truly significant to a young person, and that the congruence measures available for use today are grounded in science and endorsed by the country's leading medical institutions. I hope you can listen to children and teens when they try to express who they really are. Educate yourself about what you don't know, and take active stands against discrimination in your communities. So what do we mean when we speak of someone who identifies as transgender? This means, in brief, a person who feels that their natal sex, in other words, the sex they were assigned at birth, does not match their innate sense of self. We all have a gender, and some sense of our gender identity, even if it is not something we may have thought much about. You may say, well, of course I'm male or female, because I was born that way, and this feels natural to you. It may therefore be hard to grasp that for some people, these aspects, birth sex, and internal sense of gender, do not align. Even if you feel that you don't know any transgender people, there may well be folks in your life who you assume are male or female identified based on how you observe them, but who actually don't identify that way, and you have no idea. That is because you cannot tell a person's gender identity by looking at them. Their perceived gender is not congruent with their inner identity. The only way you will truly know a person's gender identity is if they tell you themselves, or perhaps they state it in their email signature, which has become more common today, but is certainly not a requirement in most workplaces. Gender identity is different from sexual orientation. The easiest way to think about this is to imagine that gender is who we innately feel ourselves to be on the inside, and our sexual orientation helps us know who we want to form intimate connections with emotionally and physically. Sometimes people get confused by the fact that these are two different core parts of self, perhaps because their own sexual orientation and gender identity align easily. But for many people, it is more complex. Most people have a sense of their core gender by around ages 3 to 4, though a parent may not know if a child has a sense of difference about their gender until and if the child is able to express it through words or intentional actions. Sometimes young trans children announce themselves to their parents very early on, such as an 18-month-old who says, "Mama, I be a boy," as one of their first sentences, as happened to one of my contributors in Transitions of the Heart. Or the 5-year-old who has gravitated to their sister's sparkly clothes and dresses since age 3, who gets mad when you keep referring to them as a boy, and they keep correcting you to say that they are a girl. Or you will see it through a child's actions, such as the angry 10-year-old who refuses to wear a dress for a family wedding, despite threats, cajoling, and eventually being left at home. Or the preteen who simply announces one day their new name is Jack, not Annabelle, and you realize their friends have already been calling them Jack for 6 months. Or it could be a teen who seemingly announces out of nowhere that they are transgender and they are ready to start hormones yesterday. These incidents may well catch a parent by surprise, but once parents think about it, they may realize there was already an inkling that something was different about their kid. And if you have an older child or a teen, just know that they have likely been coming to an understanding of this well before they tell you, perhaps for 6 months or even several years. It may be shocking to hear such an announcement, and you will need to go through your own grieving process and prepare for the changes ahead. But during the time when your child is most vulnerable by sharing their truth with you, it is critically important to let them know that you will work to understand this, that you still love them, and you always will. If you are an interested community member rather than a parent, you may wonder why it is important to learn about the needs of trans children and teens. If we come back to the notion of love, we must remember that these families are part of our communities. They are the students in your classroom, your scouting troop, your libraries and camps. They play sports, study music, and take art lessons in your communities. They may attend services at your place of worship. They may talk to you in grocery lines, sit next to your table at a restaurant, or come for a play date at your home. Even if it seems hard to believe, let me assure you that you have met a transgender child before. You may not have realized it because you were simply going about your day as their family was, and nobody came up to you and made a big announcement about it. Because of social congruence measures, or even cross hormones already taken, you would have no idea that the delightful 13-year-old boy in your son's karate class was born a girl. Disclosure of this information may come up because, as a Scout leader, you've been told to accommodate a transgender girl in your troop. Or perhaps you're curious to know why the young child next door cut off their long feminine curls and now has a buzz cut. Or maybe you are a parent who has planned a swim party and a sleepover, and another parent tentatively tells you that their child needs a private place to change and that they likely won't be spending the night. When you ask for more information, the parents disclose that their child is transgender. If you are unsure how to respond to any of these scenarios, you are not alone. People often want to do the right thing, but are unsure what that is. Often, the best response to any parent disclosure is to thank that parent for notifying you, contemplate how best to accommodate the child's needs, and get on with your day. If it's a neighbor or acquaintance who shares with you, you could thank them for telling you and affirm their efforts to support their child. It is never okay to out that child to anyone else or ask that parent about a child's future surgeries or inquire what is between that child's legs. If you are tempted to ask such a question, imagine how horrified you would be if someone asked about your child's genitals or your own. Sometimes being a supportive ally is really not having much of a reaction at all, but continuing to be a kind, safe person in that child's life. Being a supportive ally might include asking a child about the books that they're reading or about their favorite video game. It's about giving them a warm smile when you see them and saying hello on the street. It could also mean you take action when no one is around to validate you, such as making a donation to an organization that supports trans children, or speaking up at work if someone makes an inappropriate comment or joke about trans people. Because by the time a parent is having this kind of conversation with you, they have already done a lot of hard work. They may have already moved through the stages of grief for the child they believed they had, for the dreams they may have had for that particular child. They will have educated themselves about gender identity development in children. They may have had difficult conversations with close family and friends. They may have had to change their place of worship to a more welcoming and accepting spiritual home. They may have had to change their child's school. They have likely consulted with knowledgeable medical and mental health professionals and worked to understand their unique place straddling the intersection of the transgender and gender-typical worlds. They have reached a point where to allow their child to suffer anymore is impossible and have made difficult decisions along the way about congruence measures and disclosure to others. They have learned to hold love to be more important than social mores and societal expectations. They know that they take a risk each time they share with someone such personal facts about their child. The last thing such families need is anyone asking rude and ill-informed questions, anyone to shun their child, or anyone to pass judgment on their parenting. They have come a long way because of love. In previous eras, young children and teens who expressed gender difference were punished, told to repress it, and even sent to so-called reparative or conversion therapy, where they were taught that their understanding of their own gender identity was shameful, wrong, and something bad needing to be fixed. A well-known name in that camp was psychologist Ken Zucker, who ran an infamous clinic in Toronto that worked in the non-affirming model. Zucker's methods urged parents to withhold a child's favorite toys, to disallow cross-dressing, and cajole children into accepting their natal sex or risk rejection. Zucker wrote many books on this topic and was initially well regarded for this work. Over the years, Zucker's work began to be challenged by new generations of clinicians and families, and in 2015, Zucker's clinic was shut down. His model of care is now viewed as outdated and abusive. Such punitive measures did not and do not work. This is because, quite simply, a person's gender cannot be changed through any of those methods. And for the most part, such actions only cause a young person to suppress who they know themselves to be, often with dire consequences, such as an increased rate of depression, anxiety, addiction, and even suicide. In fact, a 2020 peer-reviewed study by the Trevor Project's researchers, published in the American Journal of Public Health, found that youth who reported undergoing conversion therapy were more than twice as likely to perhaps have attempted suicide and more than 2.5 times as likely to report multiple suicide attempts in the past year. People also frequently ask me about non-binary identities, which many youth today are claiming. Being non-binary simply means that you feel like your gender identity doesn't fall into the often constricting categories of absolutely and stereotypically male and female. In other words, the far points of the binary. Youth may feel between genders, or that they are more one gender than another, that their gender changes a bit each day, or that they simply do not have a gender at all. Such youth, and in fact many adults, may use pronouns such as they and them, which some folks find difficult to navigate. But we have all used they/them pronouns when referring to other singular people, a typical usage being something like, they left their umbrella here, and we don't think anything about it. So why do we fear using they/them pronouns so much? And why does it bother us so much when someone makes this request? In part because it's unfamiliar, or it might feel like a burden, or maybe just a little uppity. How dare anyone disturb the social order by using different pronouns? But really, this is nothing to fear. If you take the emotion out of it, if you take the fear out of it, does it really matter what pronoun anyone uses? We do not need to fear any expansions in the language around gender or in the expression of gender identity. Folks who study gender believe, in fact, that there are countless genders, and our language is inadequate at best to accommodate this. When all is said and done, it is fairly easy to ask someone what pronoun they use and to make that shift. It will not be the end of the world. Yet it can be hard to understand when one is standing in a place of privilege as a gender-typical person that there are in fact different ways of being and of seeing the world. This might be a new realization for some of you. When you want to see what progress really looks like, spend some time with teenagers. They are always a step or two ahead of us. Teens and young adults today do not want to be boxed into narrow confines of gender. Thus, they are continually expanding what is possible in language, pronouns, and gender expression, which includes how one chooses to dress and how to style one's hair. Teens today may feel that their gender is fluid or they have no gender at all. Terms such as demigirl, pangender, and NB are just a few of the terms used in high schools around the country. Teens have access to a wide variety of streaming platforms and can watch multiple TV shows featuring non-binary characters, including reality shows like Making the Cut and dramas such as Sort of. They can watch trans characters on RuPaul's Drag Race and in series like Euphoria. They may have read the Heartstopper comic book series and watched the Netflix show. And teens spend a considerable amount of time online on sites such as YouTube and TikTok, which are chock full of information about gender diversity with a multitude of real-life role models. If you're curious, read a few volumes of the wonderful Heartstopper comic series to understand how sexuality and gender are perceived by teens today, and ask your teen about the sites that they visit and the influencers they follow. You will definitely learn something if you do. Imagine for a moment a world in which everyone is free of the constraints of gender, where clothes are simply clothes, toys are simply toys, and the gender of things and of people does not mandate anyone's life choices nor their identity. A world in which you can style your hair any way you choose, dress in whatever clothes you're comfortable in, and love whoever you want to, regardless of gender. This is the world our youth could grow up into. How amazing this would be if only we were all brave enough to actualize it. But in actual fact, this world is not new. Although the historians who have recorded much of Western history have rendered this past invisible. Because trans, fluid, and non-binary identities are not new. In cultures all over the world, across time, there have been multiple ways of looking at gender, of expressing gender, among people who lived outside the confines of the binary. One such example is that of the Mahu people of Polynesia, who were considered a third gender, although reportedly mostly born male. They were highly respected as healers, teachers of hula, and keepers of oral traditions. A recent exhibit that I visited at the Bishop Museum of Honolulu focused on the healing stones of Waikiki Beach, which were said to hold the spirits of 4 Mahu healers who came to Oahu centuries ago. For many years, these stones, said to encompass both male and female healing powers, were buried underneath a bowling alley development. Luckily, local people did not forget the legend of these healers and continued to advocate for the stone's importance. Today, the bowling alley is gone, and the stones are preserved. Next time you're on Waikiki Beach, have a look around, and you will find the stones sitting in a pride of place along the waterfront. If you want to share this particular legend with your child, there is a picture book available about it called Kapa Mahu, about how the 4 entities brought the healing arts from Tahiti to Hawaii. The Mahu are only one example on a topic which could well be its own lecture. Suffice it to say, there have also been strong traditions of third-gendered or transgender people in Native American cultures across Asia, India, Africa, the Middle East, and in texts dating from biblical and medieval times. So why haven't more of us heard of these examples? This history, along with the history of lesbian and gay people, Native peoples, and people of color, is not taught often in the schools. Colonialization impacted Native cultures and their traditional views of gender difference, imposing a Eurocentric ideal of the binary. But much of this history is lost or suppressed. So while transgender people have often been written out of history, they have always been there. Perhaps this is information you can use when a relative asks why they've never heard of transgender people before. Remind them who is featured in mainstream accounts of Western white history and whose stories are not told. In the same way that transgender people have always been present, albeit hidden, persecuted, or passing, so have transgender children and teens always been with us. What has changed is their visibility, in part because there are more medical and social interventions available to help them self-actualize, and more medical and mental health professionals willing to support them. There are more legal protections in place in states such as California. And most critically, there is a new generation of parents who are more savvy about gender difference, who refuse to render their children invisible, who refuse to deny their children's reality, and are willing to advocate for the rights of their children to live full, happy, healthy lives, even if they face opposition from extended family or are falsely accused even of child abuse. Children also sense these new possibilities, and when they know they are safe to explore their gender identity, they are less afraid to do so. Parents like yourselves, as well as supportive extended family, friends, and community members, no longer have to be a child's first bully. Let's spend some time now talking about gender congruence and medical transition issues. It is extremely important to know that all the reputable national medical organizations, such as the American Psychological Association, the American Psychiatric Association, and the American Academy of Pediatrics, support gender-affirming care for teens and children. In 2018, the journal Pediatrics, a publication from the AAP, published a report entitled Ensuring Comprehensive Care and Support for Transgender and Gender-Diverse Children and Adolescents, and this has become a standard of care in the pediatric field. In 2021, the American Medical Association, alarmed by anti-trans legislation proposed by states considering making it illegal to provide necessary medical care to young people, stated, "The AMA opposes the dangerous intrusion of government into the practice of medicine and the criminalization of healthcare decision-making. Gender-affirming care," they said, "is medically necessary, evidence-based care that improves the physical and mental health of transgender and gender-diverse people." And of course, for many years, there has also been the standards of care published and regularly updated by the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, a cohort of experts in transgender care from all over the world. Their publication, the WPATH Standards of Care, version 8, is available on their website. None of these are fringe organizations. On the other hand, there are peripheral organizations which claim expert status, including the American College of Pediatricians, which the Southern Poverty Law Center, which tracks hate groups across the country, has called a fringe anti-LGBTQ hate group that masquerades as the premier U.S. Association of Pediatricians to push anti-LGBTQ junk science, primarily via far-right conservative media. Their jargon, which includes calling supportive teachers and therapists groomers and calling gay people pedophiles, is not only offensive and misguided, but dangerous, exploitative, and patently incorrect. It might be important now to clearly state what gender-affirming care actually is. Gender-affirming care does not mean that 4-year-olds are given hormones or that 10-year-olds are having surgery, as the fringe groups imply. No young children are given hormones, nor are they having any type of surgery. To be clear, with younger children, no medical interventions are used. When we say a young child around 5 or 9 has transitioned, what we mean is that they have socially transitioned and that they are allowed to live as the gender they know themselves to be. This may mean allowing a child to cut their hair shorter, grow it out longer, or wear different sparkly clothing, or different Batman-themed underwear, or go by a different name and a different pronoun. Some common times for a child to socially transition are before the start of kindergarten or when changing to a new school. Allowing a child to socially transition is not done on a whim. It is also not contagious. One child cannot catch being trans from another child. For any age child, therapeutic support may be indicated, or it may not. Just because a child, teen, or adult is trans-identified doesn't mean that they need therapy. However, it can be useful to establish a relationship with a qualified therapist before there is a crisis to support both your child and your family system. It could be useful to have a therapist on deck to provide any advocacy, resources, or supportive letters as needed. It's important to remember that not every therapist has specific training in gender identity and development, and you should never entrust your child's care to anyone who says they can change your child's gender identity. This is considered unethical and is against the law in California. Gender-affirming therapists do not pressure youth or families to take any particular path on their gender journey. We have no agenda, political or otherwise, other than supporting any young person's development of an authentic, self-defined gender, reducing risk, and infusing hope that a child can have a happy, healthy future. We help families access services, stay current on best practices, and guide parents and caregivers on their own journey of acceptance. A gender specialist can provide a safe space for a young person to find non-judgmental support for whatever is on their mind, whether it be better communication with their parents, navigating the social milieu at school, navigating anxiety, developing their own sense of self, and yes, exploring gender. Today, most practitioners provide therapy both via telemedicine or in a calming office space. In-person sessions may include playing games, making art, and using tactiles such as Lego. Medical transition measures for trans and non-binary youth begin only at early adolescence, usually between the ages of 11 and 13, at what is known as the developmental milestone of Tanner Stage 2. The current standard of care usually includes a youth receiving a hormone blocker implant, or GnRH agonist. Blockers work by preventing the pituitary gland at the base of the brain from signaling to ovaries or testes to produce the sex hormones estrogen and testosterone. This pauses puberty, so young people can buy time with their families and their care team to figure out a little bit more about what is going on with them and what their next steps could be without suffering unnecessarily with bodily changes. Blockers have been in use since at least the 1980s to stem what is sometimes called precocious puberty among children who develop too early, and the same science applies to trans youth. Puberty blockers must be prescribed by a medical doctor, sometimes after consultation and assessment by a therapist trained in gender assessment. Sometimes even just getting a blocker can save a young teen's life. As teens age, they will likely consider other forms of gender-affirming care, including the introduction of what are known as cross hormones, testosterone and estrogen. These will only be considered after a youth is assessed for readiness, can consent to this treatment, and only under the care of a doctor, either a primary care doctor or an endocrinologist. Some transgender people also choose affirming surgeries as they move into and through adulthood. Such surgeries are carefully considered and involve assessment from medical and mental health professionals, and sometimes year-long wait times. These types of surgeries can be very expensive and require some periods of recovery. Again, such procedures do not happen on a whim. Some parents worry about whether their child is old enough to make such big decisions, like stopping their development, or in understanding the often irreversible changes brought by cross hormones. It is natural for parents to be fearful of the unknown, especially around medical transition issues. It's okay to slow things down when your teenager announces one day that they are trans and demands hormones the next. The first step might be to find them a knowledgeable therapist who can help them explore their options and sort out different aspects of self. Support groups may also be a good option for teens and are offered through many gender clinics and community organizations, both virtual and in person. And scheduling a consultation with a gender clinic a few months down the road may give your teen hope that something will happen, if not today. Most likely, given young people's access to the internet, any gender questioning teen has been studying these issues for a while and will know much more about it than all of you, and they will have a matching sense of urgency around it. Do discuss these issues with your teen, but be mindful of how you phrase your concerns so that they don't tune out or accuse you of not being supportive. Let love guide you in your conversations rather than fear. Parents will benefit from finding their own support groups through an organization such as Gender Spectrum, because that will be a place to discuss your own fears rather than burden your teen with them. But do not ever think that withholding care or telling a teen to wait until they are 18 and of age to move forward are suitable options. If you find that you are resistant to providing congruence options for your teen and the clock is ticking, keep coming back to love and ask yourself if you would prefer a suffering child or even a dead one to a child who could receive gender-affirming care. Detransitioning is a topic I know some of you would like to hear me discuss. Lately, it has gotten some sensational media coverage. No one disputes that for a small percentage of adults, and we are talking small, as in 1 to 3%, there is some regret. But studies show that this is primarily due to disappointment in some aspect of surgical or medical transition, or perhaps familial or societal pressure, rather than a changed sense of self. The vast majority of adult transgender people, again up to 98%, do not regret any congruence decisions that they have made. I personally have yet to meet any transgender person, either personally or in clinical practice, who has expressed any regret about efforts they have made on their gender journey. It is so important, especially for those of us who are not trans or non-binary identified, to understand that social and medical congruence steps give people hope and keep them alive. It is impossible, perhaps, for the average person to understand the pain and despair that a teen might feel when realizing their body is betraying them by growing facial hair or breasts. This is not simply a question of accepting oneself as one is born. That is a dangerous and uninformed essentialist position on gender, which sometimes is also referred to as gender-critical thought, and is used by fringe hate groups that perpetuate the myth of the binary and don't take into account non-white, non-cis perspectives, nor the realities of non-binary people or intersex people. If we do hear about regret from trans people, it is regret for the years a person lost before they could become their authentic self. Regret that they had to go through their natal adolescence, hide who they were with friends and family, and spend years on often maladaptive behaviors, such as struggling with alcohol or withdrawing emotionally from loved ones. This can be particularly acute for those born natal males, as it is not an easy path for trans women who transition later in life to fully pass as they would wish. One cannot turn back the clock on secondary sex characteristics such as height, broad shoulders, and a low voice. This can directly lead to harassment, job and housing discrimination, depression, anxiety, and self-harm. All of us must be careful not to fall victim to misinformation around these issues. It's important to examine media sources and the studies they share with a critical eye. For example, some of you may have seen a recent New York Times article entitled, "They Paused Puberty, but Is There a Cost?" published in November of 2022. When WPATH, again, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, comprised of experts from around the globe, examined the scientific validity of that article's claims, they found glaring errors, including quoting supposed specialists who do not even work directly with transgender youth. A WPATH US Path statement about this article reads, in part, and I quote, "Misinformation about the science behind the care of trans youth can be and has been used to justify political actions or even violence against the trans and gender diverse community. With growing efforts to ban medically necessary gender-affirming care for trans youth, measured and responsible journalism is ever more essential." And you can imagine that if such misinformation is shared in reputable sources, such as the New York Times, that conservative and right-wing media literally have no idea what they are talking about. Their dangerous lies hurt our children and incite violence against them and their families. Some folks have asked about the adverse risks of gender-affirming care. I hope that you are beginning to get the sense that this is not the adequate primary question to have. Really, what we should always ask is, what are the risks of not providing gender-affirming care? Risks like self-harm, depression, high anxiety, addiction, homelessness, and suicide. But for those who want such adverse details, there are considerations which families must discuss with the professionals best suited to provide such clinical information, including the pediatricians and endocrinologists. These issues may include keeping an eye on bone density while a youth is on a blocker, and fertility preservation if cross hormones are introduced early in puberty. It is impossible to adequately address the medical and mental health issues impacting transgender youth in the time we have together, nor is this talk designed to focus exclusively on those issues. What we can say here, in the context of love and acceptance, is that young people who are allowed the space, time, and resources to affirm their gender identity have better life outcomes. For those youth who do not have access to such resources, the statistics can be very sobering. The Trevor Project, the world's largest suicide prevention organization, operates a crisis helpline dedicated to LGBT youth. Last year alone, they answered more than 200,000 calls, chats, and texts. According to a study they did last year on LGBTQ youth mental health, 45% of these youth seriously considered attempting suicide in the past year, including more than half of transgender and non-binary youth. The rates among Black transgender and non-binary youth go up to an alarming number of 59% considering and 25% attempting suicide in the past year. An example of what happens when the intersectionality of oppression and racism impacts mental health. The Trevor Project also states that only 1 out of 3 transgender and non-binary youth report having an affirming home. 1 out of 3. Of course, there is a correlation between that statistic and mental health outcomes. So how will you, as a parent, neighbor, teacher, coach, spiritual leader, or community member, make a difference in a child's life? Let's turn our attention now to the topic of school safety. Schools are expected to be spaces where children and teens can focus on their education, free of harassment and bullying. Affirming parents want their child to attend a school where a young person can feel safe using the bathroom, to be called the correct name during roll call, not be misgendered by peers, nor bullied in the hallways, or bullied by a teacher or other school staff. Yet up to 75% of transgender youth do not feel safe at their schools. When youth suffer discrimination at the very place where they are sent to learn, the result can be an increase in school absences, failing grades, acting out behaviors, withdrawal from friends and family, and high rates of substance abuse self-harm, and suicidal thoughts. In the Transgender Child's chapter, The Educational System and Your Family, we outline a number of steps to work with your child's school, including a meeting with teachers in advance of the school year, forming a gender support team, and creating a gender support plan for your student. There are further resources in the appendix of our second edition about how to create these plans. State law in California, as set in the Educational Code, generally prohibits discrimination of students based on gender, gender identity, and gender expression. State law AB 1266, passed in 2014, adds the requirement that a student must be permitted to participate in sex-segregated school programs and activities and use facilities consistent with his or her gender identity, irrespective of the gender listed on the pupil's records. National laws, such as FERPA, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, and Title IX, also protect the rights of gender-diverse kids by protecting their privacy and stating that a child may use the restroom and locker room which matches their gender identity. If you are an educator on the fence about supporting, by law, all youth in your care, please ask yourself why this is so difficult, how you can overcome this bias before you do more harm to the children in your care. There are many resources already available to help schools and all their staff and faculty within them learn more about California state laws and how best to support all the children in their care. If you are a teacher who wants to learn more, you do not have to reinvent the wheel. Organizations such as Gender Spectrum will come in to do school-wide gender trainings among staff, not just classroom teachers, but also front office staff, custodians, and librarians, and so on. On their website, Gender Spectrum also has extensive professional resources, including many easy steps that educators can take individually to ensure a gender-inclusive classroom, how to easily use gender-inclusive language with students, and how to respond to parental and community concerns about taking a gender-inclusive stand. An easy example might be asking all children to line up for the recess bell instead of saying, boys and girls line up. This information is all available online, and it is not hard to implement. Other resources that schools can use include GLSEN's work on school safety, the Transgender Law Center's website, the Human Rights Campaign's report called Welcoming Schools, and the report titled Schools in Transition, a guide for supporting transgender students in K-12 schools, published by the NCLR in collaboration with the National Education Association, Gender Spectrum, the ACLU, and the Human Rights Campaign. All these resources and publications are available online. Finally, in conclusion, I'd like to share a few lines taken from the closing chapter of The Transgender Child. It takes a particularly brave and courageous child to continue to assert their truth, a truth that runs counter to the mainstream. These gender-expansive and transgender children, often intelligent, artistic, and sensitive kids, are doing just that. Their inner integrity guides them. They struggle over and over again to show the world who they are. All they ask is to be themselves. Parents have an amazing ability to positively influence the lives of their children, as do educators, coaches, doctors, therapists, neighbors, extended biological and chosen family members. I urge you to continue working for gender equality and gender diversity and the rights of your child. Join with other parents and work for the legal, social, medical, and educational rights of all children. Support them in their self-expression and watch as they grow and thrive. Trans children, teens, and young adults deserve our love, respect, acceptance, and understanding. They deserve to feel loved for who they are and feel hope for a future in which they can safely grow up, form families of their own, and live lives which are happy, healthy, and productive. I hope I have provided information that you can take back to your families and communities and to feel inspired and empowered that you too can make a positive difference in the life of a transgender or gender diverse child. Thank you so much for having me here to speak, and thank you for your interest in this topic. Because when we believe in trans children, and in fact in helping all children grow up safely and with love, together we can and will change the world.
Thank you so much, Rachel. While Rachel takes a quick break at this moment, I would like to introduce Abby Koenig, the co-chair of Davis Parent University.
Thank you, Pam. And thank you so much, Rachel, for all of your wisdom and insight and guidance. I'm in awe of what you shared and of the depth of your knowledge, and so inspired by the charge to keep coming back to love. So thank you. And thank you as well for the support of those of you at home watching. We know everyone's schedules are jam-packed and that time is precious. Thank you for your support. And if you're thinking to yourself, how else can I support lectures or educational events like this? Well, some good news. Turns out we also welcome financial support. If you feel like you acquired a few new tools for your toolkit as a parent or a friend or a teacher wanting to support gender-expansive young people, we would greatly appreciate any donation that you can make so that we can keep bringing top-notch speakers like Rachel to Davis. Since we don't charge admission to our events, we rely on the support of our community to keep doing what we do. If you're able to make a donation, a ballpark suggestion is $10, but we will gratefully accept any amount. Donations are not required to attend our events or watch our videos, and we greatly appreciate them. If you're able to make a donation, a couple of easy ways online, through Venmo at Davis Schools Foundation. Please write DPU in the notes, or on DPU's website, davisparentuniversity.com, via PayPal. We have a donate tab, and there's the yellow donate oval at the top of our site. Thank you so much for whatever you can give. Thank you for watching tonight. And we hope to see you next fall when DPU kicks off its 15th year. Thank you.
Thank you, Abby. And now it's time for Q&A with Rachel with some pre-submitted questions from our audience members. Again, if you thought of a question during Rachel's lecture, you may email it to DPU at davisparented@gmail.com. Rachel will select some questions to be answered on Padlet, which is an online notice board, and you'll find that on DPU's homepage, davisparentuniversity.com. So now we're going to join Rachel with some audience questions. We received a lot of questions.
That's great.
A lot of folks really interested in this topic. Some with some really specific queries about children in their own lives, too. So let's start with this one. How do I protect my gender non-conforming child or teach them to protect themselves from hateful people, both emotionally and physically?
Such an important question, because safety is always paramount. What I would recommend is talking about these issues as a family. Parents can role play scenarios with their child about inappropriate things that people might say or questions people might ask them, and help the child come up with some pre-prepared language so that when these situations come up, because they will, they kind of know what to say, and they can be very boundaried. Children do not have to provide any explanation, particularly to invasive questions from adults. They can just say, that's my private business, or just walk away, really, sometimes. You know, we don't always have to answer those kinds of questions. I think also teaching older kids how to maintain integrity over their bodies, whether that be a self-defense class or just knowing really what to say if someone comes up and tries to startle them or touch them inappropriately, to have the language available.
This is such great advice about boundaries, I think, for any child
Absolutely.
and almost any circumstance,
That's right.
Because children are so accustomed to seeing adults as authority figures and feel like these adults might be entitled to answers, and you're saying that they're not.
Not when questions are rude, invasive, or ill-informed, no.
So many of the questions that we got, like I said, are from parents who really want to try to thread this careful needle for children in their families, such as, for instance, this question that we received from the parent of a gender-fluid bisexual teen who wrote to us. The parents say that the teen wears skirts and makeup, and the parent wants to know how to balance letting the child express themselves, be themselves, the way that they want to be themselves, but also help to protect them and prepare them for the kind of reaction that the child might get without undermining their confidence. It's this really careful dance that I'm seeing a lot of parents are really trying to navigate.
Absolutely. As parents, we all have fears, right? And again, about safety. But I can guarantee that the youth has thought about these things and doesn't feel really that there's as much risk as adults are going to fear for them. So again, advanced preparation. So say they wear, a really fun outfit to an event at school or to a friend's place. The youth should always know that they can call their parents at any time and the parent will come pick them up right away. They also can have a buddy. They shouldn't attend maybe alone. They should have a friend with them, or usually kids go out in groups now, so there will be support of other people around. And again, don't be ruled by fear. You know, parents just really get ruled by fear because we often consider, oh my God, the worst thing that's going to happen, right? But kids are pretty good about sort of sussing out the social environment, and usually they're okay.
You started your answer by saying, the kid has already thought about this.
Absolutely.
And you said it, and I thought to myself, of course they have.
Right, they might have already planned their outfit with a whole group of other kids, and they're coming in coordinating ensembles, or they just know that it might be a safe place. Now, is that always going to be the case? No, we can't account for every scenario, but what we can do is say, what is the safety plan here? We want you to be able to express yourself. Have you thought about the environment that you're going out to, and how do we make preparations if it goes south?
And it sounds like you would recommend that conversation not be ruled by fear, but just sort of like, hey, curiosity, hey, let's just cover our bases.
Absolutely. I think any teen is going to respond better to that than, no, don't worry about that.
I remember being a teen and not responding very well to that at all.
Absolutely.
So, yes, okay. This question comes from an audience member. It says, my older teenage child is genderqueer, interested in transitioning from female to male. At what age would it be appropriate, if ever, to communicate the concerns we feel as parents about permanent body modifications like surgery and hormone use? Also, this is sort of a two-part question. The second part says, is it okay to talk about our feelings with our older teenage children as we adults process the change?
Right, I think I did address some of this in my remarks, which is that parents need to find their own sources of support for the fears that they are going through. It is okay to talk with your kids realistically about changes that they will go through if they decide to pursue a blocker or cross hormones or surgeries down the road. All of these things don't have to be considered in one breath, though. There's often many years in between all these different procedures, so kind of start where you are. It might be just thinking about social transition, or it might be let's make an appointment at the gender clinic and just have a conversation with the specialist there. It doesn't mean they have to start hormones that day. I really recommend parents find their own sources of support for the fears and concerns that they have, and not to unduly burden their children or teens.
And this sounds like this is advice that I understand is sort of true across the board, too, that children in any situation are not to be adults' confidants. Things like job loss or divorce, or, in this case, this particular situation, this child situation. What sort of sources would you recommend that parents look for in seeking their own sort of emotional support?
Well, I just want to validate, what you're saying, and it is so important, firstly, to keep communication open between youth and their parents, but in seeking your own support, a knowledgeable therapist or a support group. Parents can go to the Gender Spectrum website. They have lots of information about how to find that very kind of support group. There are conferences around the country where parents can get together and take workshops about all of the kinds of issues, medical, legal, around school stuff, name changes, you name it, it's at these conferences. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel here. Support is out there.
Our next question from an audience member asks about the difference between sexual orientation and gender expression. You wrote about this in the book. You talked about it just now at the podium. Sometimes there can be confusion there. Oh, wait, are they trans or are they gay? Well, these are different things. So what can parents do to assist kids in having that self-awareness?
That's a good question, and they are different core parts of self. I think as parents, one thing you can do is make sure you have lots of different kinds of people in your life. Do you know any gay people? Do you know any trans people? Maybe it's about expanding your community, or, finding other kinds of role models for your kids that are reflective of all these differences, so that your kids have some information to pull from, and it's not just on TikTok, say, or on YouTube, but here's a real life person. Oh, I could grow up to be like them, or maybe I'm more like this or like that. But kids have their own sorting out to do, right? Like, some people know all this information very, very young, at a very young age. Other people take a little more time to come to it. May it change over the years, maybe a little bit. That's okay.
Our next question asks, are there updated and or current estimates for the percentage of the population who identify as transgender? How about those who identify as non-binary?
It's always interesting when people want facts like that, right?
Right, like
what is the statistic?
Give me something concrete. Yeah.
What is the statistic? Well, the statistic doesn't really matter. I can tell you that they range, right? Mm-hmm. Estimates are for the adult population, and of course, who's doing the study? Where is the study generated from? Mm-hmm. Who are they asking? You have to always ask these critical questions. But some studies I've seen show that around 1.9 or up to 3% of the adult population. But if you look at studies, recent studies of high schoolers across the country, it can be up from 15 to 19% of youth who identify somewhere on the spectrum of non-binary, gender diverse, transgender. So what we're seeing is kids just have different language and the different ability to expand the binary.
They don't see it as just black or white.
No, they absolutely live life in much more color.
This question asks, what are the best and conversely the worst things that parents and teachers can say and do for the transgender children in their lives?
Well, the worst thing is just not to believe a child, mm-hmm. to invalidate, right? And say, oh, you're not that. Or, oh, that's bad, right? Or, God will punish you, or some other statements like that are very, very harmful. You will not get a child to change their gender identity based on these kinds of statements. What will happen is it'll just go underground and then come out later, because these things do not change. Refusing to allow your child to express themselves in any way, cutting them off from their friends, mm-hmm. from their gender supportive community, which may be in person, may be online, denying them any form of self-expression, making them feel ashamed of who they are. These are all terrible things, right? And the best things you can do are come from a place of love. It doesn't mean you're at acceptance right away. right? Parents go through many, many stages where they're just trying to wrap their head around the shock of, well, what does this information mean? It takes a while to progress through these stages and get to a place of not only understanding compassion and acceptance, but also advocacy. And the best thing you can do is advocate for your child and advocate for all children.
It would take some parents a while to get there, I would imagine.
Yes, it does, and that's okay.
You've worked with families like this?
Absolutely, because it's not the job of the therapist to push people through the journey. We're not there to force any kind of understanding on people. People have to come to that on their own. What we can do is provide resources and information and help them understand what their fears are and help them move through them.
Do you think that this quest for acceptance and even advocacy is the biggest hurdle faced by transgender kids today?
I think the biggest threat right now for transgender children is politicians butting into business that they have no knowledge about and trying to create laws that criminalize gender-affirming care and punish parents that are trying to affirm their children's identity. And there are increasing numbers of states that are trying to push legislation. And California is luckily a sanctuary state, and so we have sort of welcomed our state up to families from across the country that want to come and receive gender-affirming care. That was a bit of a tangent. Can't remember the whole question.
It was
Sorry.
it was about what you feel is the greatest threat or obstacle faced by transgender kids today.
Yeah, I think it's politicians, to be honest, because other kids, if you talk to a bunch of kids, they're much more savvy about gender than adults are. I think adults are learning on this journey, but I think the discrimination that is whipped up by conservative media and the fears pushed by them and by politicians is the biggest threat right now.
This next question comes from clearly a parent. It asks, how do we help skeptical teachers and extended family members support a very young trans kiddo, age 4?
At that age, parents have a lot of choice generally, depends on their community and their resources, have some choice about where the child goes to school, right? Are they in preschool? Are they in daycare? Maybe if they have the ability, and of course there's privilege built into this answer, but if they have the ability to find a daycare or preschool or pre-K that is supportive of all children, so does not limit a child's ability to play with a certain kind of toy or shame them for putting on sparkly clothes if they're perceived to be a young boy, that just accepts them, clothes are clothes, toys are toys, and kind of just, a matter-of-fact, loving environment. Now with family, sometimes families, no matter what the age of the child, sometimes families have to make hard decisions because there may be people in extended families who are toxic and who are not safe people for those children to be around. So sometimes families have to write a letter sort of explaining if you're not on board, and you don't have to approve, but if you're not on board with being polite or being caring when we see you, we will not be able to have you in our life. And those are hard decisions for people to make, but it is about the safety of their child. I think people take time often too to understand what's going on. A lot of people don't have knowledge about this topic, and so being able to provide resources if folks in extended families are willing to consider them, because often they're not, they get their news somewhere else, and they just think that's the truth. Sometimes it is very painful for families to have to decide, well, we just can't go there on Thanksgiving next year.
Especially for a child as young as letter writers or question writers, age 4, it's really, that would be up to the parent to do some gatekeeping.
Absolutely. Parents are ultimately the responsible party here.
In your book, you share some anecdotes of trans kids whose families, extended families, are supportive, and some who aren't. For those who have extended family members who aren't supportive, in your experience, in your clinical practice, and in your writing of this book, how does that play out? What happens?
sometimes families have to just make those choices. We don't spend time with them, or perhaps we do, but the child is not left alone with those family members. So again, the gatekeeping, sort of providing a protective bubble of safety around the child. So even if you see people who you know are not approving, not to leave them alone with your child, because the child, it doesn't matter really if they're 4 or 14. Children, they are very perceptive, they are intelligent, they are intuitive. They will pick up if people do not approve of them, and this is very harmful for any age child for any reason.
This sounds like such wise advice in terms of just, parents have options for who they decide to let around.
That's right.
Their child. And you can do it in different ways at different scales.
Absolutely.
This is something that it sounds like you share with patients' families when you work with them.
Yes, there are so many ways that parents have to learn to navigate the world. It is really a burden, unfortunately, on them rather than on all of us and society as a whole to change more quickly. And it's too bad parents have to do all this all the time, but it's almost like scanning the room for safety every time you go anywhere with your child.
Do you have any final thoughts for the audience, our viewing audience, before we go?
I think I'd just like to remind people that even if you feel like you have not met a transgender child, you likely have, or a non-binary teen or a transgender adult, that these are our neighbors, these are kids and adults in our communities. They have always been here, they always will be here. You can try to legislate it away, but it's not going to happen, right? It's just like those Don't Say Gay efforts in Florida. I mean, it's just ridiculous, right? It's comical. You think by not saying gay, there's not going to be gay people. Well, it's the same with so many issues. You are not going to be able to curtail the fact that people have the right to be who they are and to grow into happy, healthy individuals.
Rachel, thank you very much for sharing with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Before we close, DPU wishes to point its viewers to resources in our community: the Davis Phoenix Coalition, YOLO Rainbow Families, and the Davis LGBTQ+ Youth Group. More information about these resources will be part of the online Padlet on the DPU website. Please look for the slide at the end of this video for the Padlet link and for the email address for submitting additional questions. One more reminder that you can purchase Rachel's book, The Transgender Child, at the Avid Reader bookstore in Davis. And lastly, if you haven't had the chance to make a donation to DPU tonight, you can do so via Venmo. The Venmo ID is Davis Schools Foundation. Just put DPU in the notes. Or via PayPal at davisparentuniversity.com. Thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at DPU's next program in the fall.